And the mindset shift is 5 years ago, this was your dream job. And I know it's hell now. I know that you're in meetings from 9 to 5. I know that your VPs love to grill you in product reviews, and every other function in the business also loves to throw dirt on you. And we have overburdened the product management role with responsibilities. So putting all that together, they just don't make time to talk to customers. And what my challenge to those people would be, go find that PM at your company who's that 10x performer. We'll take a look at how often they're talking to customers. 99% of the time, they're talking to customers all the time.
Welcome to the Product Discovery Show, a show about product discovery done right. We talk to tech leaders about the real products they shipped where user insights made a difference. We'll dive into their case studies from end to end and share the insights that transform the trajectory of the product. I started this show to help product managers and entrepreneurs do better discovery. Too many times, products fail because we targeted the wrong user problem or the wrong solution. We need more products to be successful. Our guest today is Aakash Gupta, founder of Product Growth. If you're in product, you've probably come across Akash's writing or podcast at some point alongside his 230,000 followers, where he teaches how to succeed as a product manager or leader. Before founding Product Growth, Akash was VP of Product at Apollo.io and led Product Growth at Affirm, Epic Games, and ThreadUp, and co-founded Rap2Beats. Recently, Akash came out with his book, The Ultimate Guide to Getting a PM Job, and his podcast called Product Growth, which I've been inspired by. I've been following Akash for a long time, and I'm honored to have him on the podcast. Welcome to the show, Akash. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
I've been following you for a long time, and the word that I would use to describe you is you really get things done, both in terms of when you are working as a product leader in companies and also starting your own businesses and doing your own writing. And so I'm curious, along the thread of shipping things, getting things done, what initially drew you to product and to growth?
Yeah, I started as a developer, like I think quite a few product managers. So I was actually, this is while I was in college at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and lucky enough to have like a small but thriving tech scene, thanks to like some successes that had come out of that area. If people have ever heard of like MATLAB, for instance, that came out of Ann Arbor, Michigan. And once you have one successful startup, you start to spin up a bunch more. And so I was working for this small little SaaS startup, actually profitable, bootstrapped. And what it had done is had created the de facto software for recruiting teams at colleges. So if you think of a big program like University of Michigan football program, one of their first customers, they have field recruiters, they have the coaching staff, they have the athletic director. All these people are somewhat involved with the recruiting of students, even people on the academic side of the house. And so creating the software to, for the first time, bring all of that information into the cloud and make it available on the web. So it was almost like a CRM for athletic students. And I started as a software engineer, and like a lot of bootstrap companies that don't have a product management function, when I would be given like a task, for instance, one of the tasks I really remember was redesign the website. I would always ask, well, why are we doing this? What's our goal? Who is our top visiting user group even? Are they new users or are they users just trying to log in? Like kind of asking some of these fundamental questions in order to redesign the web page. And they saw me doing that well, where it was leading to the projects that I was working on having more impact. And so that was when they said, okay, we would like you to, after college, full-time, we want you to be a product manager, work with us on this kind of work. And so I really got lucky in the sense that people recognized it in me almost, because I would say my awareness of product management was fairly low. At the University of Michigan, when I was there, I think the hottest job was consulting. So like everybody knew about consulting. In fact, the consulting club is how I met this startup to begin with. So it was interesting how I eventually made my way into product management.
It's so funny because definitely people recognize that in you and told you, hey, Akash, you would be a great product manager because you were asking all of the PM questions, right? Like, what's the strategy? Who are we targeting? How do we ship? So I think that is really inspiring because I think back in the days, I also got into UX research by accident because someone else recognized it before I did and really coached me to get into it. And so, I feel very fortunate, and I'm sure that you really enjoy doing products. So in terms of your trajectory from there, what were some of the defining companies that really changed or defined your style as a product leader? So you've done quite a bit in terms of leading product and growth in-house. So what were some of the defining companies and products that you led?
Yeah. So if you think about my journey, after the small startup, I worked in another small startup. I think both of those teach you the scrappy way of building product. Less on, and especially probably in terms of the research department, less on professionalized work on that, more like arguing from gut feel. Even in the analytics department, less instrumentation, more just this is what we should be doing. So starting from the scrappy beginnings of get stuff out, just ship stuff frequently, that was the core lesson in those startups. And from there, moving into more professionalized environments. So ThreadUp was really the first established tech company that I worked at. And it's a really remarkable company because the C-suite actually spends a good amount of time with people who they're hiring. What ends up happening with ThreadUp, because it's a secondhand clothing marketplace that actually owns its inventory, 80% of its costs get allocated to the warehouses. And so the corporate team, very lean. And so I got to benefit as a former founder. First of all, they wanted a former founder. And as a former founder, to be able to learn and make a huge impact. And so at ThreadUp, what I got to learn is what is the end-to-end of a Series C when I joined, Series E when I left, venture-backed startup really look like? What are the finance team? How are they adding value? What is the operations team? How are they adding value? And so as a result, a lot of the most successful products I shipped kind of sat at the intersection where we worked on a pricing system. It was optimizing for finances goals, on inventory turns, marketing goals, on conversion rates. So it was like a very intersectional growth product system. And so that was the kind of the next lesson for me. And from there, I went into bigger environments, actually. So kind of did the normal walk up to bigger and bigger companies. So Epic Games, $30 billion company, Affirm, Google, Apollo back was kind of the boomerang on the way back. So as I was going to the big companies, what I learned is that, holy, there's a lot of product craft. I often use the analogy of like sports because a lot of people have played sports, right? You know, the difference between a really good high school sports person and a pro athlete, it's enormous, right? Like there are high school sports people who are doing everything right in terms of the inputs, but the outputs, they're just not there. They don't have the genetics plus the combination of lifelong passion plus coaching and infrastructure, right? So the same thing sort of what I realized at, especially I would say Google, was like, wow, like the bar for PRDs here, mind-blowing. The bar for the amount of discovery before they prioritize a feature, mind-blowing. And so that was really learning about professional craft. And then the final stage for me was at Apollo, which was the boomerang back, which I mentioned. So it was back to the Series C stage, my old stomping grounds.
Very interesting because you were talking about starting off with these startups and then just kept going up and up in terms of company size. And you get to see more and more of what mature product companies look like, what their product growth looks like, discovery looks like. And I know we have a couple of examples to share today, ranging from all sizes, from startups all the way to the more established companies. But in terms of product discovery, what were some examples or companies where it really shaped how you do product discovery?
So starting at Rap to Beats, because we didn't talk too much about that yet. Rap to Beats, if you think about sort of even the fundamental insight as a founder, you're always going to have a fundamental sort of discovery-based insight. For me, I still remember the moment walking along the Detroit River, which is like a beautiful place to be. You can see Canada on one side, the United States on the other side. You see the like General Motors, like 3 towers. I think they're like 80 stories tall. towering over the city and the river. And what I noticed is that everybody is like these groups of kids like huddled around a phone, like doing something or other. And as I dive deeper, like there's two phones out. One is like playing music and the other is like recording somebody rapping. And so having this just basic insight of like, oh, look at this, like they're using two phones, they don't have access to beats, they have low quality recording. What if we could solve this problem? And so Rap to Beats was like fundamentally just based off of user discovery. And so because from its inception, we realized, okay, we're going to be a very user-driven company. Almost all of the features that we built, as I mentioned, we weren't like super professional in terms of how we did user research, but they would come from users. Like oftentimes they would come from people just emailing us. We had a little email button available in the app. And so every day we would get people emailing us features. Like I remember probably like the third day it was released on the App Store. Somebody comes with, hey, we need a rhyme dictionary. Like if I have this word, I need like suggestions of other words that would rhyme with it. And we at the time didn't even have like a place to write down your lyrics because we had assumed the use case was people are just freestyling. They're just coming up with the lyrics right off the top of their head. But here's somebody talking about, oh, actually like planning out their music. And so we didn't immediately build a rhyme dictionary, but we went and we started to investigate. Everybody is actually wanting to use this app kind of in the comfort of their own home to practice when they might go out and freestyle, because it turns out like a lot of times when you are going to go out and freestyle, some of those rhymes, like we just mentioned, they would be kind of pre-baked. Like you would know like bake and steak rhyme. And so you might put those together in some sort of two new lines when you're freestyling. And so we started to understand the use cases more deeply. We started going to talk to more people who are writing about this. And one of the first things we did, even before Rhyme Dictionary, was just create a little notepad where you can put your lyrics and you can type them up. And then from there, what if we can transcribe the lyrics that you have just recorded so that you can see the lyrics that you've recorded and you can edit them? And then finally, we did eventually release Rhyme Dictionary, but as you might expect, Rhyme Dictionary wasn't the highest impact feature. It was really just the editing notepad for people to think about and write their lyrics. And that was the ongoing lessons. And there were a million other lessons like that because we were shipping features, every day we're shipping features that take big companies like 6 months to ship. And so almost all of those came from these types of user requests and then just digging one layer deeper.
I actually love the fact that it's not professional because I think there's a lot of myths about, oh, research needs to be professional. It needs to take months to execute. It's going to be all this longitudinal work. I think the best research is, like you said, the scrappy ones that actually get you to ship quickly and see the impact quickly. So a lot of times we really do need to have the insights, ship it quickly, see it in market, and then iterate as needed. So I love the fact that you were scrappy. And so I'm curious, you said there was like an email button. One thing that I hear all the time from product folks is they don't know if feature requests from users is what I should be shipping or if I should dive deeper into it. So I'm curious, for all the things that you mentioned, so the notebook and the rhyme dictionary, all of that, how did you distinguish between a feature request and an actual problem that people want to have solved?
And on top of that, how do you distinguish between, for us personally, like when we first started, my brother and I, neither of us, had really been professional software engineers for any length of time, like just a little bit of time. And so for us, also thinking about what's really easy and quick to build mattered a lot.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, like being bootstrapped, what's going to generate money like right away, right? And so there's no sort of ability to, okay, we're going to acquire users first, and then we're going to get them engaged, and then we're going to get them to refer their friends. And then like WhatsApp, 11 years later, we're going to start to monetize. For us, it was like just about the moment in time. And so we actually had to think about every user feature request along that classic Venn diagram of, is it a real user problem? Is it going to move the business metrics? And is it easy and quick to build? Because we weren't going to do things like some of our competitors. They invested in basically creating a full studio, in your pocket. Like you could adjust the minute details of the sound along your track. But we said, no, like strategically, that might make sense, but it's going to be a ton of work. We're going to focus on this lighter use case of people who aren't like making fully baked songs, and instead like people who are like rap battling or having fun or practicing. And so I think that was purely based off of the tech side. And then the business side always came in too, which is, I think it's a really good lesson for product people who are in bigger companies, is to just think about, are we getting an ROI on this in a month, in 6 weeks, in 2 months? And so a lot of times we would quickly jump into, let's have things we can pay for. Let's test ads. And from like the second month itself, we were doing a deep amount of monetization testing on our users so that we weren't just investigating a huge free user base. Now, to get to the heart of your question, outside of technical and business, how do we really distinguish within the user bucket? And so the user, I love what Jeff Bezos said, they're going to always be dissatisfied. They're always going to have more things that you could fix. And so, like you said, it's about having a problem that matters. And then because of these two things I just mentioned, technical and business, a problem that matters that is within the aperture of your strategy. And so how I figure out whether it's a problem that matters is trying to ask them kind of very factually, how do you solve it today? And if they have some sort of reasonable workaround, maybe it's not that much of a problem yet, right? And then I also try to ask them, is this kind of the core job to be done that you have from this? Because originally in the example we gave, if it was just kids huddled around the river, if that was the only core job to be done, then actually having a lyrics notepad doesn't matter much because they're not going to be typing up the lyrics then and there. But if we do expand the job to be done aperture, then potentially it becomes a core part of the job to be done. So that's my long-winded way, but how you have to have that context, I think, in order to really distinguish like problems from normal feature requests.
Yeah. Great answer. So in terms of rap to beats, what was one feature that really had an impact both on the user side and business side? And maybe we can walk through that end to end of how it came to be, what the insight was, and how you executed on it. So thinking back, what was that thing that had the most impact?
So it sounds simple, but aren't the best core product features simple? So I'll just tell you the feature, leaderboards. Now, let me go into a little bit of how we came up with this idea to begin with. So nobody requested leaderboards. So what we really learned, though, was like, okay, we are trying to solve a social use case. And we've evolved the app to be pretty good also just at home in your bedroom. And so how do we bring the social back to where our user base has gone? And so trying to solve that sort of a deep problem to say, like, how do we really, one step along the social journey, which was kind of our MVP before we built the more heavyweight leaderboards, was let's just make it easy to share. And so make it super easy, and then let's improve the sharing, because at the time Facebook was the big platform. How do we make it look nice when it's uploaded to Facebook? How do we make it have the right bit rate, that it'll upload both fast, because most people were still using cellular data somehow for our app, and still quality enough to listen to? And so after we solved those problems, we landed on the leaderboard, and we had other options, right? We could have done things. At the time, Dropbox was big. Maybe we created some sort of collaborative rap experience. Nowadays, the app that has really replaced Rap to Beats is called Rap Chats, which is based on this idea of rap battles. We also thought about maybe you should have these rap battles. But for us, our entry point in the end decided to be leaderboards, because what we realized was people don't always have that many friends who they are pursuing this rap passion with, especially our user base. We started to look at, we're seeing people in Sweden, in like the most rural areas, downloading the app. We're seeing people in Nigeria in these regular villages download the app. It's very global because we just benefited from the App Store's distribution. And so those people, the bigger problem is, how do they reconnect with just an anonymous person? And so after having this context around, okay, our other social options, maybe they're too reliant on having an existing friend group. Let's do something for the people who don't have an existing friend group. Allowed us to invest in leaderboards. And leaderboards became a very powerful lever, because I remember, that's why I say Sweden, because we had this guy in Sweden who, anytime somebody would like knock him off the top of the leaderboards, it would ignite the fire in him to upload an even better rap. And so you're actually figuring out a way to generate more content. You're figuring out a reason for them to open up the app and see where they are on the leaderboards. So before, most of the app opens led straight to the rap editor. Afterwards, some good percentage led to the leaderboards. And so that was a really cool feature to ship.
Wow. I love gamification. And I think it's such a powerful principle to be like, we're going to motivate you through these things that, people are just really, really motivated by being number one on this leaderboard. So I want to dive a little bit into it. Is the inception of this feature looking at who's downloading our app and realizing, hey, there are people in remote villages who probably don't have, a strong group of friends who are into this, downloading our app? Is that the inception of the feature?
Right. And so operationally starts with the analytics of looking at how many of our people are in these urban centers? How many of these people are even, for us, the bigger aha moment was how many of these people are even in places where there are a lot of English speakers? Because most of these people are uploading raps in English, and in these places, there aren't that many English speakers. So having that aha moment around, okay, there's some sort of problem here. And then actually going and talking to the user. So using the analytics to figure out the right user groups to talk to, and then doing it in just the scrappiest way possible, which for us wasn't representative reaching out. It was just reaching out to kind of our VIPs or the people that matter to us. So this guy, being one of them in particular, he was a heavy user of the app. He was a heavy sharer of the app's output onto Facebook. And so just sending him an email about this idea led to him being one of the first early adopters of the feature, and led to him being one of the first sort of advocates for the feature as well, because he felt involved in the development process.
So you literally emailed the guy, say, hey, I'm the founder of this product. I would love to talk to you. And what did you talk about?
We didn't even talk on the phone. So I'm allergic to Zoom meetings, and I was back then and still am. And so we just talked over email, but actually just had these different ideas like rap battles, leaderboards, collaborative editing of your lyrics. And for him, he was very clear, leaderboards. I think it was probably just a one-word email response, all lowercase. It wasn't he was that invested in our conversation, but he was giving us feedback. And so it's interesting how we were just scrappy that way. And I think I preferred it that way too, because it was fast and easy to move on.
Very, very clear feature ask, just one, leaderboards. And so you got that request, and there are thousands of different ways to implement a leaderboard. It could be within a smaller social group. It could be with strangers. It could be, with flashy animation. It could be things that you can share. There are so many different ways to solution around a leaderboard. So how did you and your co-founder think about which path to go under?
So we finally had some developers and designers working with us as well. So luckily, the way, once we prioritized it, the developers and designers, so it's up to them. So I remember, though, the very first version we shipped, which was literally just looking at every rap that was recorded the world over in the app all time and the amount of listens to it in a hard-coded list that was updated once every 24 hours. So that was the initial version of the leaderboard. Absolutely zero interactivity. You couldn't go click into the rapper profile. You couldn't even go listen to the rap. I don't think we even checked if it was public or private. We didn't have public or private. We hadn't told the users that any of their private raps would be made public, but we just have decided everything that's been published is a candidate. So yeah, very, very scrappy. I think literally the type of thing this engineer might send me an email and say, this was way harder. But I think literally just took him an hour. And the designer, I don't believe actually even did any design, just okayed the engineer driven design. And that was it.
And then how did you iterate on it? Since it wasn't interactive, did people give you feedback? Did people email you to be like the guy that you talked to, hey, this shipped, but I really want this? How did you kind of iterate on that leaderboard?
So just very much we knew all of that 100 of things we could ship, but we didn't ship them in one swoop, with the designer coming up with some magic vision of this is the future version. I think that's a more big company way of doing it. For us, as we saw more interaction with this. I think the designer naturally got interested more in this. She comes back with like a redesigned leaderboard, still not interactive, by the way, but mainly for her looked better. Literally, it was like just text. I remember, like it was just like the song name and then the view count or something, and it looked bad. But at the time, our whole app, none of it was super well designed. It was more focused on functionality. So she was just going through a lot of the screens, making all of them look better. As part of that, because this screen got a good amount of traffic, she redesigned this screen. That led to a huge boost, I remember. And then we started to focus more on it actually as a lever. So something like maybe like 9 months passed. It's just organically growing on its own. We're focused on other areas within the business. A lot of times we're focused on like acquisition related functionality, less this sort of like engagement retention, because we had that. That was actually much better than the overall acquisition side of the business, or we were seeing more ROI from investing there. So we finally come back to this retention side of it. And that's when we started to add some of the table stakes. So I mentioned like wrapper profiles. This was one of the biggest growth features for us, because it's so cool if you discover somebody on the leaderboard to be able to see their stuff that they published. And then once people have a wrapper profile, it's like, okay, I have my SoundCloud, but I also have my Rap to Beats wrapper profile. And so they have something to customize. They have something to update, something to maintain. Then we created the ability. So people were often rapping on the leaderboards on paid beats. So we created the one-click ability for you to rap over the same beat. So then we were able to monetize on top of the leaderboard's tracks. So those were probably some of the biggest iterations.
I mean, all it took was a redesign to kick off everything, right?
At least to remind us of this feature, but also for the feature, yeah, to like start to grow a little bit more.
That's fantastic. Love the fact that you mentioned that this is not what big tech would do in terms of product discovery, but you hit all the key milestones and the key actions when it comes to product discovery. So, look at analytics. Are there specific insights from there? And then you dive into emailing people, getting some qualitative insights, and then you start to put out an MVP and redesign it and iterate on it. And I think you hit all the key milestones. So that's why these are the ingredients of successful growth.
Yes, people would be underwhelmed by the takeaway, but it's like just shipping often is an antidote to all of your process snafus.
I can definitely see that being your philosophy with your writing and your podcasting as well. So that sounds like a really, really good story from Rap to Beats. What ended up happening to the company? I see the website still being live.
So I think we stopped that maybe around like iOS 11 or something like that. And most of the people full-time off the team stopped in 2014. So what ended up happening there, like I said, more bootstrap profitable type of company, but not, especially me living in the Bay Area, not seeing the sort of, okay, this is going to be $100 billion company. Like, I think right now in 2024 and up and coming into 2025, people think it's very sexy to operate like $1 million revenue company. At the time, I think that was a lot less sexy. It was like, you want to operate $1 billion revenue company. So for us, there was no path really for it there. I think even the replacements now are just making like several $1 million, like 10 years later. So the market size on the whole of that market not being super huge was the main reason.
That's unfortunate because the story that you painted walking down the Detroit River, I walked down that same path and it was just so serene. And, I could totally just picture that scene. And it's really inspiring to hear that that was inception of this company. And yeah, and thank you so much for sharing how you did all the key discovery pieces and the lessons that you learned alongside that. So one thing that I think you mentioned that translated well to your next story is gamification. Really finding ways to motivate people through delight, through things that people are driven by, being number one, getting seen, connecting with each other. So I would love to dive into at Epic Games and some of the research that you were doing or product discovery that you were doing that really led to really insightful shifts on the gaming sides. I think most people might know what Epic Games are, but for those who might not know, can you give us a little bit of context around the company?
Yeah, so if you're a little bit of an old head gamer like me, you might remember the Unreal Tournament days, or you might remember the Gears of War days. Both of those were Epic Games properties, and underneath both of those sat the Unreal Engine. And so Epic has kind of these two core layers to the company, the engine and then the games on top. And so the next evolution of Epic games was Fortnite. It hit the scene in 2017, and it quickly became the biggest game in the world by revenue, exceeding over $5 billion. And a tiny little company supporting Unreal Engine making $5 billion meant they did something like $4 billion in profit. And so very, very successful game. Out of nowhere, the company blows up. Right after the blow up moment is when I joined. So that was a very, very cool time to be there. And they had an amazing UX research team led by this fellow named Ben Tails, who's still there. Amazing analytics team led by this fellow, Darren Clary, who's still there. Like, these are like people who they live and breathe Epic Games. They were there like 10 years before. They're still there 10 years later type people. And they did a lot of this cool discovery work, but I was involved more from the product and strategy elements of it. And for me, one of the biggest sort of growth wins that we had was Fortnite had this concept of seasons. And at the time, each season led to the release of a new battle pass. And each battle pass was by far our biggest revenue driver. When you looked at what was generating a lot of those profits, battle passes were generating a lot of those profits. And so what tended to happen at the company is that everybody, first of all, it's gaming, is working crazy hard. And every single season, there's like these 100 changes we want to make. And we're like 50% of the way through the list when it comes time, theoretically, for the next season. And so we would say, oh, we have to get these other 15% of features. So we're going to delay the season launch by 3 weeks, and we're going to get those. And so we'll have the 65% complete season. So facing this problem, what we tended to do was we would do very little play testing of bringing people in. We had like literal rooms where we could see people playing the new season because we'd just be running up, we'd be delaying the season. And so from my product strategy angle, one of the things we wanted to push was shipping more seasons and shipping the seasons that we have on time and shipping them at quality. So the first sort of evolution was just shipping more seasons, which we were able to accomplish, through a combination of creating red and blue teams. So a team working on the current season and the upcoming season, through a combination of reducing the amount of scope we expect to change in a given season, through increasing headcount, through these types of elements. But we're still running into this quality issue. And so that was where especially Ben's team, but the whole leadership team invested in, let's do more playtesting of seasons while they're being developed and before they go live. And so this was a really phenomenal sort of initiative because even if you get 15 people playing Fortnite for 3 hours before the game, you actually generate a good amount of data that Darren's team then can go look and say, hey, compared to the current season, people are getting killed at a distance 30% greater in this new season. Usually, actually, when you look into the psychology of the game, when you're getting killed from far away, you usually have less control over that death, which means you tend to rage quit and be less happy about that death. So then we could architect the season balance, sort of the availability of snipers versus AKs versus pistols versus shotguns to reduce snipers and increase pistols and shotguns, for instance. And so we can make these sort of proactive problem solving, proactive quality, whatever sort of adjustments you want to call them, before the season shipped. And I think the analogy for other people is, let's invest in actually putting our products in front of users before we ship them. Very few teams do this. These days they might do prototype testing, but we all know the Figma prototype and what's engineered, there's a big difference in what ends up coming out. So actually taking that engineered item and then putting it in users' hands. And then the bigger lesson too is seeing it in person. We all know that there's a huge difference between a session replay and the analytics data and actually just watching people in person using your product. And so those were the big insights for me that really allowed us to ship seasons more frequently so we get more revenue, but also at higher quality.
feel like a lot of teams want to do that, but usually it's impossible to both ship fast and also ship quality. So your example sounds really, really interesting. So I want to dive into a couple of things that you mentioned. First is you talked about the psychology of gaming. It feels like, based on your description, something pretty analytical of, hey, compared to the previous season, we have 30% more deaths at this stage, and people are going to rage quit earlier. So in terms of the psychology of gaming, I'm less familiar because I have never worked in games before, but is there like a threshold that's like a golden threshold of we need people to hit this many kills or this many achievements by this time in order for them to stay addicted and engaged? Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so your average games company, more of the roadmap is driven by a visionary game director and game design core head team than product management for this very reason, because there isn't per se metrics or anything like that, or even having this deep insight around long distance kills. One can still imagine a world where you just wanted to create a sniper game, right? And so there's so many different types of games. And really, like, for us to have that strong belief in not getting these long distance kills was based on knowing our player base at the time, who was playing our game in the context of what other games they have available really deeply. And understanding that they do like the ability to have some long-range kills and deaths, and it should really be skill-based. But if we have too many of those, people are going to rage quit. And so it's about that deep understanding. And I would say, like, everybody in this sort of strategic design group layer, they're watching the YouTube videos. They are playing with people all the time. And they're also looking at the data. And they're saying, okay, these are our 90 million monthly active users. This is the profile of them. This is because we have the Epic Games Store. We can look at these are the other top 5 games those people are playing. What are they playing? What do they like out of those games? And so it's a lot more art than science, much harder to architect. But at the same time, I feel like those core principles of, you need to have a really intuitive understanding of your users, right? You need to really be able to understand what they want out of it, exactly how much challenge they should have versus they shouldn't. And you're right, the amount of achievements. So interestingly enough that you mentioned kills, because a different project that I worked on was matchmaking. And that was exactly based around sort of this science of what should your kill-death ratio be, and how do we make it so that the people who have really low kill-death ratios have higher kill-death ratios? Because obviously, if you're less successful at something, you're less likely to continue. That's always the case, right? So how do we make more people more successful? And so we solved those problems by taking the basic chess ELO system, creating an ELO system so that we're bucketing people live. There's actually a huge live services and game infrastructure problem, because if you're thinking about so many simultaneous live users, millions of live users being connected across different servers, it's a problem of, well, when do you just decide to collapse 2 buckets together, and when don't you? And so getting through all of those nuances of the matchmaking system, and also something that Fortnite is notorious for now, which is releasing NPC bots that behave like players. And so we created AI to create invisible computer players so that the really low kill-death ratio people have these AI to shoot off so that their kill-death ratio goes up, because realistically, there's no other way to solve the problem. They can't kill humans.
Wow. So what it sounds like is you brought the science into this art of designing games to make it more engaging and to help, people who may be new to the game, who are not so good at it yet, to feel more confident, to build more confidence over their skills.
Yeah, and it was like, we couldn't there wouldn't be a way to create a regression based on ELO of what ideal kill death for retention is. So you just need to have your own sort of gut feeling. Some groups of people, they're not getting enough kills. Now that you have that strong gut feeling, and you can get crucially your whole leadership team to buy into that, then you can choose a metric around that. What's the kill death ratio of people with ELO less than 500? Then you can move that metric.
It's interesting for product folks to think about in a field like gaming, the arts is really the ones calling the shots, and then the product brings in some of that science to continue to make it engaging. So I find that to be fascinating. I'm also curious if there are other types of gamification principles and psychology of gaming nuggets that you'd like to share, because I don't hear that often enough.
I think it could be like a 12-hour masterclass sort of podcast, but the 2-minute version is the psychology of dying is very interesting, and it relates to the psychology of failure. So what happens, for instance, where I last worked at Apollo.io, when somebody downloads a contact list of 100 contacts, they create an email sequence, they send out 4 emails to the 100 contacts over 4 weeks, and they get 0 replies. That's kind of like dying in a video game. It's like you just put in all this effort, and the result is for naught, right? And so in the video game space, I think they're way ahead than regular software on this, which is like, I remember our design director. So he was a guy, Jason, who had built a bunch of the Call of Duties. So he had years and years of battle-hardened experience on shooters. He was telling us, like, we need to make dying more fun. We need to make dying more fun. And I remember the first time I heard him say that sitting on the couch, I was just like, what is he even talking about? But he would literally go into, what does the animation look like as you're being killed? What is the perspective, the angle of your viewport? How far away is your viewport from that, right? So first, starting from the animation to make it beautiful. And then actual post-death experience, are you able to spectate the person who just killed you and learn more information about the weapons that they used and the distance and what they're up to now? Are you able to replay the death so you can potentially learn about it and see it from different angles potentially or different distances? Are you able to then immediately ready up and go into your next match if you're done with it and you want to move forward? Do we present to you some of the achievements that you had in that game unrelated to killing and death? And all of those elements really made dying a lot more fun. And so we took some similar principles at Apollo, like if you didn't get a reply rate, what if we highlight the achievements related to opens that you did get? Which one of your emails opened the best? And then to ready you up to the next match, what if we use AI to say, hey, based on what's opened, we recommend a new sequence like this. And based on the types of people who opened, we recommend changing your contact list like this. And so you can sometimes analogize from games, and that's just one concept, the psychology of death. That is probably, one of 100 that we could do in this 12-hour masterclass if we wanted to do it on gaming. But there's so much to learn. I think people, and it's also vice versa true, but it's just that it goes back to that classic lesson of like, pay attention to the products you're using. They're doing some pretty intentional stuff.
Gosh, if you ever start that masterclass, I'd be the first to sign up, because this is fascinating stuff, right? Like the concept of rejection when your emails don't get replied to being the equivalent of dying. I think that is fascinating. Also, another thing that you said about the example that you just gave was you said not enough companies do playtesting before they ship products. Why do you think that's the case? And why should companies do playtesting before shipping products?
There's probably 3 big reasons. The first reason is that there's a structural difference between shipping an update in Fortnite versus shipping normal software. Your average software, a lot of times you're just accessing it via the browser. They might even like a Facebook, they might be shipping like 100 updates a day. And so they kind of just have this belief like, we should just ship to 0.1% of users and we should just quickly get real data out in the wild. And so they kind of prefer that reality. And with Fortnite, it's different. If we're going to ship a new season, it's often like an 85 gigabyte file. Users are going to have to spend 3 hours downloading it. And most people are kids. They don't have very expensive computers. It'll take an hour just to update the game. Okay. 4-hour process to update. So before we ship this update, we want to make sure it's pretty baked. So there's a higher bar versus the lower bar in these other environments, especially these browser-based products where they can just ship an update right away and all people do is hit refresh and they've seen the change, right? Most of that happens on the server instead of on the client. And the second reason is that people do prototype testing And they feel like that's enough, where they don't recognize the difference between a prototype and what's actually been live and coded. And in my experience, there's a lot. Usually there's design flaws that they haven't recognized. There's user experience or edge cases that they haven't recognized. There might even be performance issues with how it loads, how long it takes to load. And in gaming, that's everything. If you increase latency between the mouse click and the shooting, that actually experiences, all the good gamers are going to leave instantly. If Figma, which it has done in the past, as we all know, suddenly increase the latency between moving your mouse and how it's updated in the web, people will probably be okay with it if they fix it in a few days. And so that's the second thing, is this importance around performance. And that tends to drive it. And this prototype blindness, where they don't perceive that performance difference between prototypes and what's shipped as important. And then the third reason, I think, is because people are just in a rush. People, they don't even leave time after something's shipped to fix it, let alone create a little buffer time in between something developed to go test it before they fix it. And so people are always constantly, they're estimating 6 weeks for a feature that ends up taking them 9. And if they go test it, it's going to take them 12. And so they'd rather just ship it on week 9.
So with all of these reasons, thinking about, non-gaming related tech scenarios, would you recommend folks do user testing or the equivalent of playtesting before they ship products? Or in big tech scenarios, it's much cheaper, much faster. You can ship it to 0.01% of the user base. What would your advice be? Would you want them to reserve time to do the equivalent of playtesting, or just ship it to the wild?
Depends on the feature, depends on the impact, depends on what sort of risks remain. And so I always try to use this framework of what's sort of the biggest risk? What's the biggest unknown? And how important is this feature? And how easily is it for us to walk back? So if you're going to ship something huge, like let's say Miro, they just shipped their innovation workspace. They just spent a whole bunch of money on a branding campaign around the innovation workspace. That's not the type of thing I think they should ship to 0.01%. It's a big investment. It's hard to walk back. There's a lot of eyes that are going to be coming to it at once. In those senses, it really mirrors the Fortnite seasons that we were talking about. And so because it's now hit those criteria, I'm guaranteed they did playtest it, where you actually have people use the version of the software in person. So they're in Amsterdam. In Amsterdam, you get some Amsterdam folks to come into the office and you watch them use the software, because there is really no replacement. And I'm sure Meta, before they release the Oculus Quest 4, they will do the exact same thing. And so it's interesting that the Meta newsfeed team probably doesn't do it as much as they could. Like the next time they want to create a new toggle for a For You versus following feed, for instance, they should consider playtesting it. I think it's a big enough change. If they do the change, they could market it in a huge moment. Maybe they could finally bring some attention back to Big Blue, which is lacking, right? So I think there's a lot of ways that big tech teams can think about, how do I invest in bigger launches? And this is a trend we're already seeing. So 2 companies that are really prominent examples of this are Airbnb on the B2C side and Brex on the B2B side. Both of them have basically moved to 2 big yearly releases, because then you have that huge marketing moment. And so if you're going to have that, then you should do a lot of playtesting before.
Love it. I love the framework of risk, because it's similar to what Jeff Bezos has always said, one-way door or two-way doors. So if you cannot walk back on the change, then let's make sure to have proper playtesting, user research before that. And that's probably also why for physical products, a lot of those companies, CPG companies, so on, they do a lot of market research before they develop and release that product. And I think, Akash, you also mentioned, so from Epic Games, you ended up at Affirm afterwards, and you also had some examples from there on how they did product discovery. So I'm curious, what's new or what's different at Affirm compared to all the previous places, and any stories you can share about Affirm?
So Affirm is different. I think it's the environment that actually probably more PMs will resonate with than what we've been talking about so far, which is like you have a user research team. you have a sales team, you have a customer success team, and hopefully this isn't the case everywhere for you guys, but I know it is for a lot of you. You're not even allowed to just go talk to customers. There are no easy ways to go do it. And so I wanted to talk about this example because all my examples fundamentally just relied on me just scrappily talking to customers in various scenarios, or just inviting, literally at Epic, I could just invite customers in to go use my feature, There was so much access to customers, and they encouraged me to play the game at work. So I was getting so much feedback. And then I come to a firm and no feedback. Yeah, good luck going to talk to Amazon or Apple, where we actually make all our money from, because, only VPs and above in sales can talk to them. Okay. So now you're disconnected from where your money comes from. You're disconnected from your users. As a product manager, supposedly you're still the voice of the user and the advocate for the customer. So you're supposed to know the most outside of user research about the user and customer. Gosh, how do you handle that? And so for me, it was then like thinking really deeply about the tools at my disposal. Like what, these big companies do tend to have is freaking awesome experimentation platforms, awesome product analytics that is instrumented to the teeth. Every event is captured because they don't even care about the data warehouse cost. So sitting on that, and session replays are recorded for 11% of users, not 0.01%. And they're recorded in every use case, right? Every edge case, you're getting all the screens. Like, okay, so I'm poor, I can't go talk to customers, but I'm rich. I have a ton of data, a ton of sources. And then how do I sit on top of those sources, right? So what was really interesting is like our user research team would use these kind of modern platforms like Dovetail. And in Dovetail, a lot of times they would mark all their research as available for everybody. And in Dovetail, you could go search based on like a certain keyword to find all the user research chats about a specific keyword. And so using what was rich in the analytics and saying, okay, wow, everybody who opens the Affirm app, they go to the repayment page. 95% of the product work before I've joined is all on the homepage. And in fact, nobody has touched the repayment page in 3 years. Store that nugget away. Then go into the session replays. Start to watch people, opening up the app of all sorts. Straight to manage, straight to that repayments tab, straight to checking on the status of their loans. If they're overdue, immediately making a payment. If they're not overdue, but they don't have auto pay on, turning auto pay on. So people worried about, of course, their credit scores and coming in and then using the session replays to discover like, okay, this is what's happening, right? And then going further and commissioning with my user research team, hey, I think there's a high value project in here somewhere around growth for repayment users. And I've searched through our Dovetail and stuff. And what I've noticed is that we're not talking to these users that much about this. And so I would like us to do a study here. I think that there's probably something around building growth in. Here's like 7 napkin sketches of ideas I have. So commissioning that study as head of product growth, getting the buy-in, which by the way was a lot of work. It's just convincing the core product leaders that all their amazing studies that they wanted to do, those aren't important. Convincing the researchers that this is an important study. But okay, we finally reserve like 10% of one researcher for 1 quarter. She's going to help us with this. And so getting that insight then from her, okay, wow, like 4 out of the 10 people she talked to, they're overdue on a loan. We don't want any growth from them. We don't want them as customers, let alone we don't want them taking out another loan. 4 out of 10 people she talked to, they didn't realize this, but they had like thousands of dollars of buying power with a firm. They're always paying on time. They're always checking their loan status. We could potentially suggest to them another loan. And interestingly, right, they don't know their buying power. So we can put their buying power directly on the repayment page because we know they're skipping the homepage from the session replays. Taking all that information and putting it in front of product leadership and saying, yeah, let's prioritize this feature. And then the repayments team saying, oh, this is going to be a huge issue, right? Payments actually has user research support. So then getting that person to do more deeper work so that finally on our roadmap, the next quarter, we could ship into repayments page. And of course, it was one of the biggest things my team's ever shipped. but humongous win because we were focused on activating people into the Affirm ecosystem. And so people would find us via Apple, Amazon, Shopify. They would manage their one loan, but they would never get into the ecosystem. Now they see, oh, there's this ecosystem. I have this buying power. So it was the biggest lift in activation that we had.
Fascinating stuff. So you were able to convince the team, the repayments team, to do more work. And what was the feature that was launched on the repayment side from this work?
So we ended up launching the feature on their surface, but the work they needed to do was they have like repayment analysts who basically run the roost in terms of what's shipped. Like they create these very detailed models all the way down to the cent of how this is going to affect repayment rates and loan volumes and all sort of stuff. So they needed to model this napkin sketch that I had, which basically said like, it would be like, the repayment page, it was very bare bones. All it showed was like your amount overdue and then your loans in a list. So depending on your loans at the list, at the very end of that list, we'll also say you have X more dollars in potential amount you can spend with Affirm. And we would click here and that would take them to some recommended merchants. And so that was what was shipped, but they needed to do the whole analytics, and usually they would have research inform that analytics. So a researcher would go in and they would talk to people and they would show them, like, at this point, a lo-fi wireframe, try to understand how many people are actually going to take up a loan, and also the type of people who are going to take up the loan. Are they high credit, 800 plus credit score? Are they 700 to 800? Are they below 700? And go from there.
Really interesting. And the first time that you approached the research team and tried to convince them to do that research, as someone who had to navigate it from the research side, I can tell you we hate saying no. Sometimes to prevent us from working 80 plus hours a week, sometimes we do have to make that call. So how were you able to convince them for those in big tech who are maybe experiencing the same barriers, how were you able to convince the research team to dedicate time towards this repayments deeper dive?
Ultimately, I think if I'm being real, like it was just being friends with the user research leader and having more trust built up. At that point, I had been there for 7-8 months, and he could see, oh, wow, Akash's team is shipping stuff that matters. If I get affiliated with some of his work, we'll get affiliated with some high impact work. That's realistically what drove it. But, tactically what I did, anything he asked me to do. He asked me for a 1-pager on the project. Went to the top of my priority list. There were some follow-up questions on my 1-pager. I tried to answer them within 24 hours. When it finally came to his quarterly planning, when it came up, and it was in the whole product leader's sync, I kind of raised my hand and said, like, yeah, I love his roadmap for his quarter, right? So I think those are probably the tactical things I did along the way.
Being likable and being responsive. Check. And at the beginning, you mentioned that Affirm was different because it had its own dedicated research team. And so you almost lost direct access to users. So I talk to PMs all the time, product leaders all the time about that dichotomy of in what situations would you prefer to have like a structured research team versus just getting access? I ask this because this is a very hot topic in the research community as well, democratization. And in my case, a lot of times we want to give access to our PMs to talk directly. And I'm actually of the mind that we need to foster interest in discovery work. And so the best way to foster that is to give them direct access. So I'm curious, how do you think about that democratization? What's kind of the push and pull for you when it comes to a firm where they had a dedicated research team versus getting direct access to users?
Yeah. And then I think like when it gets democratized, sometimes there's a lot of like bars around it. Like, we need to see the interview guide. We want you to stick to the interview guide. Make sure you say these things. Make sure it's recorded. Make sure it's tagged in Dovetail. Make sure it has these things. And so I'm of the mind that like PMs need unfettered, unguardrailed, unlimited access to customers. And I think that honestly, a lot of product leaders are setting up a portion of their product managers to fail when they aren't fighting for that. Because what ends up happening is you start to assume that you, the product leader, who has the benefit of all of the executive Slack channels, all the executive documents, and is getting really good feedback on what customers and competitors want because you're hearing from customer success, you're hearing from sales, you're hearing from marketing. You start to think that the individual PMs have that level of context. And you say, I hired from Klarna and now they're at a firm, they should totally know. Turns out, Klarna and a firm are totally different businesses. They're targeting totally different segments. They're in different geographies. They're different leaders in different ways. They have different AOVs. And so your ICPMs are not getting that. And to have that sixth sense that we were talking about earlier, going back to the startups, like how was I able to consistently ship features that mattered for Rap to Beats? Basically create a category that should have $0 spent and have millions of dollars spent in the category is by having a spidey sense around the customers. At Fortnite, how did we know about long distance kills? It was because everybody at the company, literally everybody, is playing the game for hours a day with real people. Like they all totally understand it. And so to walk into the environment where I'm literally not even allowed to go talk to customers is, it's very handicapping. I would say it was hugely handicapping for me, where like I would often tell PMs if I were writing a blog post, try to ramp up on most of the domain knowledge in 90 days. Realistically, at a firm, it took me like over a year and a half to ramp up on all the domain knowledge. And a lot of that is because you just don't have that access to the customers. So what I think is best is to figure out like, what are the exclusions? Like PMs need to go through X amount of training. We need to make sure that they're not going to do these things like show up to the meeting late, ask questions that's going to make them churn, ask them things that are sensitive topics for sales, right? We need PMs to do that. At the same time, we also need them not to follow research bad practices, They need to be asking questions in a certain way. They need to be giving certain reminders to the people at the beginning. So having kind of these trainings, and I almost think of it as like this graduation moment. Like you've done a few research sessions with research, you've done a few research sessions with sales. Now you've graduated. Now you have access to a low touch process in order to talk to customers.
This is great. Fantastic advice. And I think a lot of researchers would probably agree with you that we don't want to be gatekeepers. We want to give access and manage reputational risk. I think that's a lot of what goes through researchers' heads of like, okay, is there a reputational risk for the company? Is there a reputational risk for if we say that you're with the research team, but you're asking very pointed and biased questions? And a lot of it is just risk management. But for folks who I see two camps of PMs, right? One camp would be, yeah, I would love to do more research. Maybe I just don't have access to users in your case. The other camp would be, you know what? I have enough analytics. I don't need to talk to users. And I probably know enough about users. What would you say to that camp of folks who say, I have enough just with the quantitative data and I can run experiments? What's the value of talking to users in that case?
I honestly haven't met any PMs who would say that to my face, but I have met PMs who, by their actions, they're kind of saying that. Because, one of my favorite things to do when I meet PMs in person is be like, when's the last time you talked to a customer? And face to face? And oftentimes it's like, talk to a customer last month, face to face, never. Yeah. Right? And so by their actions, they're kind of saying what you've just said. But if I were to ask them, theoretically, yeah, talking to customers is very important and there's a limit to analytics. And so what I actually find is that there's a gap between the theory, which I could explain to you, but, in 2 or 3 sentences is to have a true North Star about your customers, to have a sixth sense, to develop the elusive product sense, you must regularly talk to customers. Like that's the 3-sentence summary. But there's this gap between this theory and then the reality and the practice of product management that you see day in, day out. And I think that the number one thing I tell to those product managers is let's get a mindset shift. And the mindset shift is 5 years ago, this was your dream job. And I know it's hell now. I know that you're in meetings from 9 to 5. I know that your VPs love to grill you in product reviews, and every other function in the business also loves to throw dirt on you in terms of the things you're building and how well they were built. So you're living in that world now. And I think that's the thing, is that people, they get overwhelmed by their 9 to 5 calendar. They get overwhelmed by all the things they have to do. And we have overburdened the product management role with responsibilities. And so putting all that together, they just don't make time to talk to customers. And what my challenge to those people would be, go find that PM at your company who's the 10x performer. And go take a look at their calendar, go take a look at their mindset, and go take a look at how often they're talking to customers. 99% of the time, they're talking to customers all the time. 99% of the time, their mindset is more positive, where it's like, yeah, things are going well. This job is hard, but I'm chugging along. And 99% of the time, you'll find that they're really good at saying no to stuff that shows up on their calendar. So they'll be able to say, okay, I know I got invited to the product review of my best friend PM because I could support them. Sorry, best friend, I can't do this because I need deep work time this morning. And then, sorry to the VP of product who invited me to the sales call. I know I could learn a lot at the sales call, but I need to work on talking to customers one-on-one. There's all these different things you have to be able to kind of finally assess. Yes, this thing you invited me to is good, but it's really a B-. And talking to customers is almost always like an A+ activity. And the last thing there is that it doesn't have a short-term impact, which is why people don't, like if you just spend 30 minutes to say no to a meeting to work on a PRD, at least somebody might high-five you about your PRD tomorrow. Versus talking to customers, maybe it pays off in your product sense, which pays off in what you prioritize at 6 months down the line, which pays off in something that ships a year down the line. And so just having that long-term mentality and trying to act like that 10x or PM and bridge the gap between theory and reality is what I would tell them.
I'm so happy that you talk about the theory and the reality because, when we're in school, we're all taught, yes, we should do X, Y, and Z. And you should talk to customers. You should prioritize time to learn an up-level in communication. You should figure out how to manage stakeholders. And then you're thrown into the reality of it. And like you said, calendars are 9 to 5 packed, back-to-back meetings. And so it really takes conscious effort for product folks to save time and spend time to do research and to talk to customers. So what would you recommend in terms of cadence? So when I talk to different product folks, they would say, sometimes once a month or sometimes once a half, once a quarter. What would be the right cadence in your mind of getting exposure to customers?
My personal is like the fire hose needs to be on. Like, how am I architecting my life so that I'm getting feedback like every 2 hours, realistically? So what I mean by that is, a customer success team pulls me into the Slack channel of our biggest customer who's struggling with a feature I shipped last quarter. How do I make sure that happens? 2 hours later, I get a report from sales. We have $18 million in pipeline. These are the top 5 feature requests representing 70% of the pipeline. 2 hours later, how am I involved in an automatically scheduled customer conversation? This is one of the biggest hacks for me at Apollo. I just set up a full automation system. Fully automates the entire customer conversation. All I had to do was identify the parameters in advance, and a month later, this meeting is showing up on my call. 2 hours after that, how do I, as of my design, engineering, and product trio, look at session replays of customer? And then tomorrow morning, how do I get sent a user research report from my research team who did a really deep investigation into this new problem area we're looking into, right? That is what a really rich fire hose of customer information looks like. And I say it that way because it mirrors a lot of how I like to do it as a founder. And that's where I got the inspiration is you're on the customer support email address, so you're just getting it right away. You're selling the big deals, so you're getting it right away. You do have somebody focused on customer support or in sales who's summarizing it for you. And then as features are launched and people have trouble with them, you're getting pulled in. So those are like the 5 buckets that I try to think about. How do I just constantly architecting my life so I'm getting that level of feedback? And then to your specific question, like how often should I be talking to customers, right? I think that personally, for me, I could not go without a dedicated 30-minute conversation with customers every week, plus text interaction 3 to 4 times a week, like over Slack, or I literally keep like my 10 favorite customers on text because people respond to text the best. And so I would say that is the minimum level. And it doesn't matter if you're B2C, B2B, enterprise, SMB, you still want that level of connection to your customers.
You're setting the gold bar, Akash, for customer exposure. I think these are all really, really good actionable advice that PMs and other product leaders can follow. Are there other advice that you might have for product discovery when it comes to both working at a big tech and also founding your company? What are some other tips and nuggets that you might give?
So two types. One is like how to run your customer interviews, because I see a lot of mistakes there. And then the second is how to collate your insights, because I see a lot of people doing research that it only impacts their brain. And by the way, only for a year, and then they forget after that. So let's start with the mistakes I see in customer interviews. I see a lot of people ask questions that are leading and biased, like you said, or they're not factual. So they're things like, what is your biggest feature request? What is the last problem you had is a different question. That's a factual question. So if you think about feature request, it's a want, it's a hypothetical. What was your last biggest problem? Then you can ask them follow-up questions about that factual situation. Okay, where did you open up on the app? Why did you have that goal? How did you end up solving it? And I think a book that really beats this point home, which I literally think only takes 2 hours to read, or it only took me 2 hours to read, is called The Mom Test. And so it's like $15, super well spent, and it'll explain exactly this hypothetical versus factual. Or you can just listen to any podcast with Teresa Torres. She also does a fantastic job explaining this. But despite these thought leaders existing, I would say I had PMs even at Apollo when I'd come into a research call or I'd look at a recording from them where they were asking hypotheticals. So it's not that their advice has permeated 100% of product managers. And then the second set of mistake is that so many people, their user research exists basically in some Zoom recordings that live in some Google Drive that when the employee leaves, they're gone. And then whatever Google Docs and Google Slides are left from them. That's the extent of the research. And it kind of worries me, honestly. It's like, if you're going to be doing research, even as a product manager, take some notes, write down that you reached out to this person. Let's have some place where we can see so that we know, okay, this person is involved in 7 research calls over the last year. That we obviously shouldn't reach out to them again. Or this person has been involved in 7 and they're amazing and they want to be involved in more. Maybe we graduate them into some sort of ambassador or feedback program, right? And so if you're going to suddenly democratize up to the whole company, you do still need some way to document what reach out has happened. And what I say is like, at least, and this is kind of a minimum even for PMs, a 1-line summary of what you learned or what you talked about. So we have the documentation of who was reached out, when they were reached out, and at least 1 line, but hopefully your researchers, they're coming up with a very nice report even, right? And then they're linking that to the 10 people. And so creating what I call is basically like your customer discovery insights hub. And it can be built out of software if you want. I mentioned Dovetail. There's other software. There's Interpret. Nowadays, Product Board is getting in that game. There's other software too. Or build it out of hand. Like oftentimes we just had it in a Notion database. I think people even do it in Google Sheets, but I think having that, I personally love the software these days. And it's not like to push the software on people or push another cost on you, but it's so great to be able to, for instance, query AI to say, find me the 6 conversations related to this topic. Then immediately it helps you find them. And you can find one from 3 years ago. And it turns out like customer problems, they don't tend to change that much. And so it's still useful.
I love that you bring up AI because that's going to be a game changer. Like you said, a lot of the customer problems are evergreen. And one common complaint I hear from researchers all the time is like, new PMs are asking us about the customer problems, asking us to do more research, but it's the same problems. And what I typically tell them is with anyone new joining in, it's better for them to hear the pain points directly from customers. It's one thing to read it in a report, it's another to hear it directly. Even though the problems are evergreen, the immersion still matters. And so with that, Akash, this has been a wealth of advice, information, great examples, great analogies with gaming and psychology and how we can apply them in the tech industry. And you've been giving listeners so much in this episode. How can people find you? For those who are new, who may not be familiar, how can people find you?
Check me out on LinkedIn. It's probably the easiest, most accessible form. If you like podcasts, I have a podcast. If you like deep content, like research content, Actually, these days, my newsletter has kind of turned into a user researcher. Like, people have been joking with me that that's what I become, because for most of my pieces, I just interview a couple people and I kind of like bring you their insights. And I say just, it's a lot of work, but the reason I do it is because I'm competing with AI, who AI can't go talk to new people. So I compete with AI by talking to new people in the newsletter.
I love it. And no one does what you do, Akash. And I love the infographics that you have in your newsletter content. Love the podcast that you churn out podcast episodes, I think every 3 days, 2 to 3 days. So definitely outperforming AI in those respects. And Akash, thank you again so much for being on the podcast and really, really giving enlightening advice and examples about product discovery. And for listeners, we will see you next time. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for listening. If you like this episode of the Product Discovery Show, please subscribe and share it with anyone who's had trouble getting product market fit. You'll save them from the sleepless nights and nerve-wracking product reviews. Background music is composed by our friend Philip Pecker. Thank you and see you in the next episode.